are going to talk about the U.S. involvement in World War I. It's really important for us to realize that World War I marks really the end of U.S. isolationism in terms of foreign policy, which we'll talk about quite a bit when we go through these videos. Okay, so a little bit of a European history background briefly, but just to remember, one of the major reasons why the war breaks out is because there are these two major alliances. One is the Central Powers. You have Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And then you have the Triple Entente, or what, from the US perspective, we tend to call the Allies, Great Britain, France, and Russia. It's important for us to realize that the Triple Alliance, ultimately the enemy of the US, is surrounded by the Allies, which effectively creates a two-front war for the Central Powers, which is one of the reasons why they lose. But these alliances ultimately end up actually involving many other countries as well, which is one of the reasons why the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 escalates a prompt entry into war. So the Archduke was traveling through Serbia, and he was shot and killed by a Serbian nationalist. And this immediately enraged the Germans, who very much wanted to try to get the Austrians to retaliate against Serbia. Serbia, on the other hand, was trying to get an alliance with Russia in this process. To a certain extent, this also links back to a long-standing struggle between different powers in Europe trying to have greater influence over the Balkans, which is where Serbia is. But in any case, the assassination was essentially the tipping point, and there was an increased need by Austria and Germany to try to do something in retaliation to Serbia. But then Russia ultimately argued that if Austria or Germany would do anything to Serbia, then Russia would feel obligated to defend Serbia. And because of this alliance, all the other countries that are involved would also feel the need to respond to their respective allies. So as you can see, in the early stages of World War I, the United States doesn't have any involvement whatsoever. And they wanted it to be that way. So when Wilson was president, he actually issued a proclamation of neutrality. So it was actually a formal statement that the U.S. would not be involved in this foreign conflict. He also urged U.S. citizens to be impartial in the conflict. This is sort of a long-standing trend in U.S. policy. The United States tried to be neutral in many other major conflicts in history. If you remember, in the earliest stages of the American Republic, George Washington also issued his own proclamation of neutrality. Remember that during the French Revolution, there was a push. There was actually essentially a struggle between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans over whether to side with France. And there was a general urge to be neutral in that conflict as well. So in any case, this isn't really surprising because this was the traditional approach that the U.S. took when there was a large-scale war going on abroad. Wilson, as I was saying earlier, really urged American citizens to be impartial as well. And in the next slide, I want to look at a map that's going to show us why that was actually very difficult. The U.S. was bombarded with pro-war propaganda from both alliances. So there was this pressure in the U.S. to join either the support of the Central Powers or the Triple Entente, but ultimately Wilson wanted to restrict siding with either group. There was a general thought, just like the U.S. Civil War at first, that the war would be short. But as we know, with the benefit of hindsight, the war was prolonged, it was deadly, and it was dragged into a stalemate. And the U.S. doesn't get involved until that stalemate occurs. One of the reasons why neutrality was very hard to maintain was that the U.S. did have economic ties with many European countries. And there was, very early in the war, a British blockade, which essentially cut the U.S. off from trading with Germany. And the U.S. at that point started to trade more with the Allies, more with Great Britain and France in particular. And because there was an increased demand for manufactured goods as well as food, the Allied countries increasingly relied on an economic connection with the United States. So again, even though the US remains neutral for the first 3 years of war, it's still helping the Allies from an economic perspective. So it's never fully neutral. And so you can see with this cartoon here, despite the Neutrality Act, there is clearly this connection between the US and the Allies because they're providing so much aid in an economic sense to these other countries. So, as promised, I wanted to explain why there was this struggle among Americans as far as who to side with in this international conflict. As we know, the United States was a ethnic melting pot of sorts, and you had people that had ancestors or may have directly come themselves from countries that were involved in World War I. So I want you to really take notice of the light blue on this map and really see how many people of German ancestry made up the United States. And of course, as we know, the Germans were one of the major enemies of the Allies in the United States. But since we have German immigrants and German descendants in the United States, clearly they felt torn about this issue, whether to side with their homeland and potentially family that still live there. So in the early stages of the war, neutrality was ideal for all parties involved. As the war progresses, people of German descent in particular are going to experience more problems. So you can see that neutrality sort of would help that ethnic tension, at least in the early stages. Okay, so I mentioned this before, but again, one of the major reasons why the U.S. essentially cuts off trade with the Central Powers is because Great Britain issues a naval blockade. And when it does this, it's very difficult for the U.S. to make any connections with the Central Powers. So in some ways, it's by default that the U.S. has a greater economic tie to the Allies in Great Britain and France. Neutrality is going to be something, as I said before, that's really difficult for the U.S. to maintain, and there are going to be a series of militaristic events that have U.S. victims that will eventually prompt the U.S. entry into the war. So the first major one that you need to know is the sinking of the Lusitania. So the Lusitania was a passenger ship, a British passenger ship, that was torpedoed by a German submarine. This happened in May of 1915. So the ship, at first there was a claim that the ship was totally neutral since it was carrying passengers. But it actually did, in secret, have military materials in it. And that's what the Germans used as justification for torpedoing and sinking this ship. But regardless of whether it had military materials in it or not, there were almost 1,200 victims, and 128 of them were Americans. And so Wilson saw the sinking of the Lusitania as a very aggressive move by the Germans against the Allies, but also specifically the US, because there were American victims. You can see at this point that members of the U.S. government are still very torn about what to do to respond to the Lusitania. Wilson demands an apology from the Germans, which he does not get. You actually have Wilson's Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, resign. And part of that is because he feared that Wilson was bringing the U.S. closer to war by his approach that this was a very aggressive militaristic act against the Lusitania. So William Jennings Bryan made the argument that any ship that was carrying, it was essentially carrying contraband because it had the secret armaments in it. William Jennings Bryan said that carrying a ship full of contraband with passengers on it would be like putting women and children in front of an army. And so basically William Jennings Bryan sees Wilson to be too warlike, which causes his resignation. And but what does happen after the Lusitania is that the Germans do, for a brief period of time, stop what was called unrestricted submarine warfare. So prior to the sinking of the Lusitania, the Germans were bombing, or torpedoing ships in open waters very regularly. But after the Lusitania, because of the outrage, in March of 1916, Germany issues the Sussex Pledge, which was essentially a promise that they would no longer bomb passenger ships. Now, again, the Sussex Pledge is only temporary. We'll see in a moment that the Germans do return to unrestricted submarine warfare, which prompts war. But on a temporary level, there is some appeasement between the U.S., the rest of the Allies, and Germany after the Lusitania incident. Okay, so despite the fact that the Sussex Pledge did place a restriction on submarine warfare, Wilson still is making some efforts to get ready in case there is war. So this is another reason why we're getting closer to war, even if it doesn't immediately happen. It seems like at first Wilson was very dead set on neutrality, but after the Lusitania, it seems like at the very least we could call Wilson's approach one of preparedness, not one of neutrality. So he doesn't necessarily want to go to war, but he plans to be ready in the event that it would happen. So one thing that happens is the National Security League, it actually was created in 1914, so it already existed, but it becomes much more active in supporting militarization after the Lusitania incident. So the National Security League was a patriotic organization that supported greatly expanding the military. In general, this was one organization that started to increase more support to actually get involved in a military sense in the war. Wilson seems to be in much more support of increasing the militarization of the U.S. after the Lusitania. Also, Wilson signs the National Defense Act, which doubles the size of the Army, and it also integrated the National Guard from the state level to the federal level. So this is important because we see that there's an increased mobilization of the Army. The reason why the National Defense Act was signed was Wilson wanted to ensure that there would be immediate availability of wartime weapons and equipment. So basically, in advance, before the U.S. declares war on anybody, they're already getting ready to have access to weapons. They're issuing contracts to produce gunpowder and other military material. So again, this indicates that this is a policy of preparedness, no longer neutrality. Just because Wilson is pushing more towards war does not mean that everyone else is. Realize that Wilson sort of uses the idea that he hasn't gone to war yet to actually win his re-election in 1916. So his re-election slogan in 1916 was, "He kept us out of war." So people who supported isolation continue to vote for him, and he won the election of 1916 pretty handily. Wilson is going to break his diplomatic relations with Germany. And what's interesting is that Wilson then attempts to arm merchant ships to make sure that trading ships are more adequately protected, because Germany is turning again towards unrestricted submarine warfare. But anti-war senators in Congress actually block his efforts to arm merchant ships. So you can see that just because Wilson seems to be increasingly approaching the possibility of going to war, he hasn't convinced the rest of Congress to do so. So another event takes place that really pushes the U.S. more in the direction of war, and this was the Zimmerman telegram. So this was a secret note that went from Germany to Mexico, and what it did was it asked Mexico to attack the United States. Germany said that if Mexico attacked the United States, that Germany would help Mexico regain some of the territory that it lost during the Mexican-American War. So if you see here, the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas were promised to go back to Mexico if they successfully attacked the U.S. So basically what the Zimmerman telegram was a proposed German-Mexican alliance to obviously threaten the U.S., and it certainly works. What it did first, because of course it made news headlines, was it increasingly prompted outpourings of anti-German feeling throughout the United States. Also, this is a huge military threat, because if Mexico were to attack the United States, then the war would actually move to the United States' backyard. It's much easier to remain neutral when the war was an ocean away. And so the Zimmerman telegram was a major threat to the United States, and this is ultimately going to be what convinces Woodrow Wilson to get Congress to authorize declaring war on Germany. So it's important that events like the Lusitania and the Zimmerman telegram lead towards war, because both of them were acts of aggression that had implications in the U.S., right? The Lusitania had U.S. victims, and the Zimmerman telegram was at least a threat that there would be an attack on U.S. soil. And so we see, just like previous wars in history, that the U.S. waited for there to be a reason to justify going to war from a defensive perspective. We really don't have the types of war at this point in history where the U.S. launches an offensive. They're always doing something in response. It seems like war is always the last choice among diplomats in this point in history. So Wilson, when he goes to Congress to declare war, his justification behind going to war is to keep the world safe for democracy, not to crush the Germans, right? To try to defend U.S. democracy, right? Again, the real reason, historians argue, is that it's retaliation against U.S. power, against safety on the sea among passengers on a ship like the Lusitania. It's, of course, against the threat between Germany, Mexico, on the United States with the Zimmerman telegram. And also, another reason why Wilson might have pushed to go into war is because then he would be able to play an active role in the peace settlement terms after the war was over, which we will talk about in detail once we get to the end of the war. I'm going to keep these videos in reasonable chunks, so to talk about the actual war, I'm going to start a new video here, so stay tuned.